I will talk about 4 key trends, and this is apart from our most recent China consumer report when I want to talk about what we're observing. I want to share a bit about consumer confidence. I think many of you will have read that the consumer confidence this summer has reached a 10-year high. So we are in a good mood. Consumers are happy, but let me also talk about basically how the Chinese consumer and the macroeconomic development go together and what are potential risks from what this may bring. I mentioned the gyms already in my basically opening words. I would like to talk a bit more in general about health. And I think what's interesting on the health side is also how the interpretation of health is very different in China than in other parts of the world. I think no presentation without talking about the post-90s, or millennials as you may want to call them. And we're showing basically how that is shifting, what part basically of growth will come from that group. And the last point, and that's actually my favorite, is talking a bit about the question around brand preferences, particularly in the notion of Chinese brands versus foreign brands. I think there's been a lot of talk around that, about Chinese brands basically gaining market share. Why is that? Is it an element of nationalism? There's so many questions around that, so I would like to actually put a bit of time into that to demystify some of the claims which are being made around that and what's really happening here. So I think those are the 4 main trends to talk about. If you think how basically those things happen, it's typically all driven through social media. So it's not driven through interventions, it's not driven necessarily through the media, but it's driven based on basically personal experiences communicated throughout friends. So in a way you could say yes, but it's not easy for an individual or like a particular authority to do that. I think it needs to be something which basically happens to all of us, and then basically we spread it through social media. I think that's typically how the effects come up. If I talk about the gyms, I mentioned in the very beginning the gyms, why do they show up? And the only reason is because people basically post their running records on the social media apps. I think all of you will use WeChat, and you probably know what I'm talking about, the running tracks, the achievements on the treadmill, the whatever 100-kilometer competition, the 10-kilometer competition, all of that. And it's driven basically typically on social media. So in a way, social media in this respect allows to manipulate, but it's like a group and in a way a bit chaotic way to manipulate. I wanted to talk a bit about the clouds. Like what I mean by that is this is on the macro side, some of the points which may basically bring a problem to consumption and to consumer confidence. If I start on the right here, with aging populations, so far it hasn't changed that much, went from 9 to 10%, but it'll be an increase. And not an increase that much over the next 3 years. But if you take a longer horizon, there's definitely something around the aging population, which will lead to the need for the young generation to support the old generation, which will have a negative impact on consumption, potentially confidence. Housing prices, I think we know to some degree that actually plays so far to an advantage, because still Chinese own a lot of property, and being able to sell it at a high price actually had so far actually triggered positive impact on consumption. With a potentially smaller number of people owning property in China and actually needing to pay rent, that may be a negative impact. I think the reason why that hasn't played out yet so much is because still the rate of Chinese who actually own property is still extraordinarily high. Income growth, last year I've seen 6.3% income growth. It used to be 10%. I would say 6.3 is still a basically good number, is still a solid number. The question is what will happen if it comes further down. I think if it stays in the range from 5 to 10%, I think it's still meaningful more money, gives me a lot of confidence. If it starts to stagnate, which we're seeing in part of the country, part of the age group, part of the educational level, I think there's yet also a risk here. And similar with household debt. I think household debt, we'll see in a moment. Household debts actually so far has increased, actually very much driven by online, because online retail actually were the ones who really been pushing consumer lending. And what you see here is just a few years ago, household debt in China was 30%, now it's 45%. Still half or less than half of that what you would have in the US or the UK. It's a bit less than what you have in Germany. But if you just look at the relative term, part of the consumption, as you see here, has to actually be driven by people taking more debt, household debt. I think there was a question.
This income growth figure would be in absolute terms, right? So you see a problem in when the absolute income growth drops. So even if people are able to afford more goods in relative terms, that's a problem. Because it looks as if they're gaining less.
You're right. First of all, inflation has been low, which is good. So that is nominal income growth, but you still have a real income growth because the inflation has been very, very low. This means 10% increase on salary. Year in 2010, and this is 6.3. So the growth has been less, but it still means more money